At 04:37 a.m. on January 14, 1944, in the freezing compound of labor camp E93 in Upper Silesia, the temperature sat at minus 11 degrees Celsius, the kind of cold that turns breath into smoke and steel into ice. 312 Polish POWs stood in formation boots, sunk in frozen mud, waiting for the German guards to finish roll call. Less than 70 yards away, under the half-built Schwarzwasser Bridge, lay 102 kilograms of TNT wired into a detonation grid the Germans insisted only their engineers could touch. A painted metal sign on the generator hut repeated the rule every prisoner already knew by heart. Prisoners are forbidden to touch any electrical installation. Violation results in immediate execution. The guards repeated that warning twice a week, sometimes 3 times, when rumors of sabotage floated through the barracks. The order wasn't just strict, it was absolute. No POW had ever survived being caught near the electrical hut. As a lesson, the last man who tried Joseph Malinowski was shot 26 years old, former electrician, October the 3rd from Katowice, for and now prisoner number E93-145. His body was left outside the fence for 9 hours with a dented tin cup in his pocket. It was the only personal object he still owned after 4 winters in captivity. He used it to drink, to scoop coal dust, to break ice for water rations. He had never imagined it might one day decide whether a bridge lived or died, or whether thousands of civilians on the other side of the Schwarzwasser survived the German retreat. The Germans planned to detonate the bridge on January 18th to stall the approaching Soviet First Ukrainian Front. Their retreat plan depended on it. Intelligence whispered among prisoners estimated the demolition would cut off at least 2,500 German infantry and 40-plus transport trucks on the eastern bank. It would also trap more than 5,000 civilians who had fled earlier fighting. If the Germans lit the fuse on schedule, the eastern villages would be left exposed to scorched earth orders. The cost of that single collapse could reach into the thousands of lives. Jan discovered the truth by accident 40 minutes before dawn. Assigned to clear ice from Pier 3, he noticed water sheeting unnaturally around the base. Beneath the surface, barely visible in first light, were 4 wooden crates and a coil of cable leading into a steel junction box at deck level. The Germans weren't hiding the explosives. They simply assumed POWs were too terrified to act. Jan followed the cable with his eyes and traced it to the small generator hut on the embankment. He saw a guard emerge, adjust his belt, light a cigarette, and step away without locking the door. It was the first time in at least 6 weeks that Jan had seen the door left unsecured. He stood frozen, scanning left and right, calculating odds the way he used to calculate current loads in the mines. If even a single German engineer checked voltage before detonation day, his chance to interfere would vanish. If he approached before nightfall, he would be seen. If he did nothing, the explosion at 05:20 p.m. on January 18th, based on wire-length charge timing and typical retreat doctrine, would erase the entire eastern approach in under 6 seconds. He knew exactly what the system inside the hut looked like. The Germans used an 18-volt low-current ignition relay connected to spring capsule number 8 blasting caps. Sensitive, reliable, vulnerable to any sudden surge. A misaligned breaker or sharp metal strike could force a premature arc. Any unplanned arc would fire the caps without delay. But to reach the panel, Jan would have to break the single rule that defined the camp's existence. No one touches the electrical systems. Not prisoners, not assigned laborers, not even guards without authorization. Infractions were punished at the wall, no hearing, no delay. Jan studied the pattern of guard movements during the prior week. 2 perimeter patrols circled the huts every 20 minutes with a 3rd guard drifting between the generator hut and the supply depot. He estimated a clear window of 17 seconds between sight lines. 17 seconds was enough to approach the door wedge, strike the breaker twice, and get clear if nothing went wrong. But something always went wrong in E93. Men collapsed from hunger. Frostbite turned fingers black. Tools froze to steel. Even the TNT under the pier sweated moisture that could unpredictably change the firing time. The camp was a system of failure, except for the Germans' confidence in their own procedures. That overconfidence was the only weakness Jan could see. He returned to the barracks at 05:11 a.m. heartbeat, hard enough to echo in his ears. He checked the tin cup. The rim was bent, giving it a sharp edge. A sharp edge could strike metal faster than a fist. A fast strike could create a directional spark. A directional spark could bridge the gap in the relay. He rehearsed the motion in his mind: open door with left-hand pivot, raise cup strike, twice, drop run. 6 steps, 8 seconds, no more. At 05:24 a.m., he overheard 2 guards complaining about the cold and discussing evacuation orders. They mentioned the Soviets reaching Krapkovich by January 16th. That meant the Germans might blow the bridge earlier than planned. Jan's margin shrank from 4 days to possibly 2. He walked back outside, breath fogging the dark, and looked again at the unsecured hut door. A thin strip of frost hung from the latch. The guard had truly left it unlocked. In 4 years, he had never seen that happen twice in one morning. It was a statistical impossibility that felt like a signal. Jan reached a conclusion in less than 5 seconds. If he obeyed the rule, the bridge would explode on German terms, and thousands would die. If he broke the rule, he would almost certainly be executed, but the bridge might collapse early, before any retreat, before any civilian burn orders. Obedience guaranteed tragedy. Disobedience offered a sliver of hope. He tightened his fists around the tin cup and whispered to himself the same sentence he used when wiring unstable circuits underground. If it has to be someone, let it be me. Then he made the decision he knew might be his last. If you believe John was right to break the rule, comment the number 7. If you believe he was wrong at like. And if these forgotten corners of World War II matter to you, subscribe so you don't miss the next story. At 06:02 a.m. the same morning, while the guards barked orders and the prisoners shoveled frozen gravel along the riverbank, Jan kept replaying the structural map of the Schwarzwasser Bridge in his head. The bridge was only 43 meters long, but it sat on the single, most important retreat artery for the German 371st Infantry Division. Every supply line the division depended on flowed through that crossing ammunition trucks, averaging 2.6 tons of cargo, each fuel trailers carrying over 4,000 liters of gasoline and infantry columns that could stretch more than 800 meters when fully assembled. If the Germans triggered the charges on schedule, they would create a bottleneck that would slow the Soviet advance by at least a full day. But if someone detonated the bridge early before the Germans were ready, the collapse would cut off 2 entire regiments on the East Bank and prevent them from torching 3 civilian towns marked for compulsory clearance. German doctrine in this region followed a predictable timeline. When a retreat line collapsed, engineers blew bridges within a 15-minute window after the last vehicle crossed. They document this practice at the Dunajec River in May 1943, the Lizwarta crossing in October, and again at the Oder tributaries in December. Jan calculated that the Schwarzwasser Bridge would be used as late as possible, meaning the Germans might delay demolition until the final hour. But he also knew that the Soviets' rapid advance toward Krapkovich at 18 kilometers per day could force German commanders to accelerate their timetable without warning. The margin for intervention could shrink from days to hours. Jan had spent 4 years studying every pattern the camp produced. The guards rotated in 6-hour blocks. the electricians inspected the generator hut at 06:20 a.m., 02:40 p.m., and 9:15 p.m. One guard named Schreiber always smoked at precisely 06:05 a.m. beside Pier 2, creating a 60-second blind spot. Another guard, Butcher, routinely cut corners by skipping night checks if temperatures dropped below -10. Jan's mind recorded these patterns the same way he used to memorize current ratings and fuse tolerances in the mines. In his old life, he measured risk in amperage and torque. In this new life, he measured it in footsteps, cigarette breaks, and guard fatigue. He knew exactly how many seconds it took to cross the yard without leaving footprints that drew attention: 14 on dry snow, 21 on ice. He knew how often the Germans replaced the blasting caps, every 2 weeks, always on Thursdays, always by the same engineer. And he knew that the elderly generator in the hut, a Siemens model built in 1928, produced a voltage drift of 0.3 volts each time the relay coil warmed. That mechanical quirk mattered. A drift that's small could shift the load just enough to make the relay susceptible to shock. It was a vulnerability the Germans overlooked because they assumed no prisoner would ever dare get close enough to exploit it. To understand what Jan intended, you have to understand what his life looked like before the war. He was born in 1917 in Katowice, grew up 3 streets away from the biggest coal mine in the region, and became an apprentice electrician at 17. By 19, he was wiring ventilation fans in shafts that ran 90 meters under the earth. By 22, he could identify a failing relay by sound alone. 38% of pre-war Polish industrial workers were in either mining or heavy manufacturing. Nearly a third of them had some exposure to electrical systems, but only a fraction were trained well enough to understand ignition circuitry. Jan was part of that fraction. His technical instincts were sharp because they had to be. A bad connection underground didn't just inconvenience someone, it killed people. He carried that memory into captivity. Every time he looked at a relay, he saw the same lethal precision he had learned to respect a decade earlier. Life in Camp E93 compressed that precision into survival. The prisoners slept on straw mats that weighed less than 6 kilograms each. Their daily ration averaged 800 calories, watery soup, 150 grams of stale bread, and sometimes a spoon of margarine. Frostbite claimed 6 men in December. Dysentery claimed 9 more. The average prisoner weight dropped below 51 kilograms by the winter of 1944. None of them had gloves thick enough to hold metal tools safely at -11 degrees. Fingers cracked, bled, froze, healed badly. Jan's left index finger had been broken in a beating in 1941 and never fully healed. The tin cup he kept was more than a utensil. It was the one object with a reliable edge and a predictable grip, something he could use even when his hands were numb. When he first saw the TNT crates under Pier 3, his mind jumped instantly to the West Bank where more than 5,000 civilians had taken shelter. He had seen them weeks earlier when the labor group marched past mothers carrying sacks, children wrapped in blankets, old men leaning on door frames. If the bridge blew on schedule, the fire break orders would activate. German units executed those orders without hesitation at Szczekova, Olkus, and Miskov, killing thousands in a radius of only 24 kilometers. Jan understood that the Schwarzwasser Bridge was not just a tactical point. It was a trigger for a humanitarian catastrophe. That knowledge pushed him beyond obedience into calculation. He tracked how long it took for the river to freeze at different temperatures. At -11 degrees, the surface thickened enough to support a person after 21 hours, but would not support a truck until 34. If the bridge collapsed early, the Germans could neither cross nor burn the East Bank quickly. They would be immobilized. The technical detail that struck Jan hardest was the fuse design. Spring capsule number 8 required only a small electrical impulse, about the same charge you could produce by striking steel on steel under the right conditions. A tin cup sharpened by years of freezing and denting could produce such a spark if it struck a relay at the correct angle. And because the relay sat on an older Siemens board, the housing had a known flex point on its left bracket. One well-placed hit could force the contact to snap shut. 2 hits would guarantee it. By 08:10 a.m., he had reconstructed the entire mechanism in his mind, down to the number of seconds required for each movement. He knew where he would stand. He knew where the nearest guard's shadow would fall. He knew when Patrol A turned toward the fence and Patrol B turned toward the kitchen. He knew that he had exactly 1 moment in the upcoming night when the hut door would be unobserved long enough to strike. If he missed that window, the guard routine at 02:40 p.m. would reset the system, and any chance of premature detonation would vanish. The more he calculated, the more inevitable his course of action became. Every variable he studied pointed to the same conclusion. The Germans had built a perfect demolition system, but left it vulnerable to the one man in the camp who understood electricity deeply enough to use that vulnerability. And that man knew that waiting meant surrendering 5,000 lives to a deadline set by someone else's clock. If you agree with Jan's assessment that doing nothing was the greater danger comment, the number 7. If you think obedience would have been the safer course hit, like So We Know Where You Stand. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. At 09:42 p.m. that night, after a full day of forced labor that left most prisoners barely able to stand, Jan sat on his bunk and replayed every movement he would need to execute. He had one chance, one window, 17 seconds of darkness between 2 rotating guard paths that almost never aligned, but on this night would. He had mapped their pacing for months. Guard A walked a 90-meter loop around the barracks, taking exactly 51 seconds per lap. Guard B patrolled the generator hut's perimeter in a shorter 40-meter loop, 36 seconds per lap. Their sight lines crossed only once every 14 minutes, leaving a blind spot that lasted precisely 17 seconds. Jan did not discover this by luck. He discovered it by counting footsteps during every night shift since October. 100 nights, over 20,000 steps measured in silence. At 10:06 p.m., he confirmed the pattern again. Guard A paused for a cigarette at the same spot as always, near the burned fence post left over from a failed escape attempt in July. Guard B scratched his beard, adjusted his rifle strap, and walked toward the latrine exactly as he had the night before and the night before that. Jan noted the timing both guards would turn their backs at 01:27 a.m. That would be the moment. There would be no second chance. He tucked the tin cup inside his coat. It weighed barely 100 grams, but felt heavier than any tool he had ever held. Its rim was sharp from years of dents. In normal light, it would shine. In moonlight, it would flash. In darkness, it would become invisible. He rubbed his fingers over the edge until he could feel the shape clearly, even with numb hands. He needed to swing it twice fast without missing. If he missed by a centimeter, the metal would not spark. If he struck too hard, the noise would echo. Too soft, and the relay would not arc. He whispered the motion to himself the way miners whispered, fuse counts raise, strike, pivot run. A thin layer of frost formed on his coat by 11:30 p.m. as prisoners were ordered into the barracks. The Germans preferred silence after lights out, which made any sound dangerous. Jan lay awake listening to the river under the bridge. Even from 70 meters away, he could hear ice cracking. Each crack reminded him of the weight of the TNT tucked beneath Pier 3. 4 crates each containing precisely 25.5 kilograms of explosive, 48 blasting caps arranged in 2 parallel strands, 1 main line, 1 backup. Engineers designed the system for guaranteed reliability, but electrical systems built for reliability also react predictably under stress. If Jan could hit the relay at the exact moment when the voltage drift peaked, the board would snap like a dry twig. At 12:54 a.m., he rose from his bunk. No hesitation. Hesitation kills timing. He moved through the barracks without sound, stepping only on knots in the wooden floor where the boards were thickest. 15 steps to the door, 8 seconds to lift the latch without creaking, 2 seconds to slip into the night air. The cold was worse now, near -12. Breath disappeared instantly. Snow muffled everything, which helped cover footsteps, but also meant footprints would remain visible at dawn. Jan solved that problem the same way miners avoided debris trails underground. He walked in a zigzag pattern that matched the natural drift lines of the wind, making each footprint fade into existing snow patches. It added a few seconds to his route, but any straight-line trail would have exposed him immediately. At 01:24 a.m., he reached the shadow of the generator hut. He crouched and checked the yard. Guard A was approaching the southeast corner, 30 meters away. Guard B was approaching the latrine, also 30 meters away. Perfect timing. The 17-second window would open exactly when predicted. Jan touched the tin cup again to steady his hands. They were shaking from cold, not fear. Fear he had burned out long ago. At 01:26:48 a.m., the guards turned their backs. Jan moved. 4 steps to the door, left hand on the latch. The latch stuck for half a second because of ice. That half second nearly broke the entire plan. He pressed harder. The latch shifted silently. He eased the door open exactly 1 centimeter, enough to slip his arm inside, but not enough for light to escape. The faint hum of the generator filled the room. The relay panel glowed dull orange. Voltage drift was peaking. He had maybe 6 seconds left. He aimed the cup. Angle 30 degrees downward edge leading. He struck the relay bracket. Once, a quiet metallic click. No spark yet. He struck again. Harder. At 01:27:19 a.m., a blue-white arc jumped across the relay, less than half a second, but bright enough to burn into his eyes. The blast caps would fire within 4 to 5 seconds. That meant Jan needed to be at least 20 meters away to survive the pressure wave. He slammed the door shut and ran. He made it only 10 steps before the first explosion erupted beneath Pier 3, a deep concussive thud, then a second sharper blast as the backup line ignited. TNT amplifies shock by 90% in confined structures, and the riverbank acted like a natural amplifier. The wooden supports shattered. Metal beams snapped like brittle bone. By 01:27:24 a.m., the entire midsection of the bridge began to collapse. John dove to the ground as a wall of hot air swept past him, carrying splinters, ice, and debris. He felt the ground shake. He heard steel scream. He smelled burning insulation drift through the night. Behind him, the generator hut's lights flickered and died. Ahead of him, the Schwarzwasser bridge folded into the river in a roar that echoed for almost 9 seconds. Then everything was quiet except for collapsing ice and distant shouting from German guards who had no idea how the bridge had blown 5 days ahead of schedule. Jan pressed his face into the snow and waited for his heartbeat to slow. He had struck twice. The relay had sparked. The charges had fired. The bridge was gone, and no one had seen him. If you believe this decision changed the fate of thousands, comment the number 7. If you believe the risk outweighed the reward, hit like and subscribe if you want to see the next chapter of this story. At 01:31 a.m., only 4 minutes after the last span of the Schwarzwasser Bridge disappeared into the freezing river, Jan forced himself back onto his feet. His ears rang. His vision pulsed. He had less than 3 minutes before the guards reached the generator hut, and no more than 10 minutes before every prisoner was dragged from the barracks for interrogation. The success of the strike meant nothing if he could not vanish into the same darkness that had delivered him to the hut. He brushed snow from his coat, checked for scorch marks, and began retracing the jagged, wind-shaped path he had memorized earlier. Straight lines were death. Footprints were evidence. He stepped only on the ridges of snowdrift, where the wind had formed natural wave patterns, letting each step sink half an inch rather than the full weight that would freeze a perfect boot mark. It cost precious time, but time was no longer measured in seconds. It was measured in likelihood of execution. At 01:32 a.m., the camp erupted with noise. A whistle blew, a rifle clattered, a guard shouted something unintelligible over the river's echo. 2 floodlights snapped on, bathing the bridge in sharp white light and revealing nothing but smoke-broken beams and rising steam from shattered ice. The Germans had not planned for a midwinter night explosion. Their standard protocol assumed daytime demolitions, clear lines of sight, and engineers on standby. Tonight they had none of those. Their confusion bought Jan at least 40 seconds. 40 seconds was life. He reached the barracks at 01:33 a.m. and slipped inside. The men inside stirred awake from the blast, but because the Germans screamed orders outside, no one noticed Jan entering. He lay down on his bunk, rolled to his side, and pressed the tin cup against the wall, letting it fall between 2 loose boards. Not hidden, not buried, just misplaced in the same way. Dozens of other objects lay scattered across the barracks. The safest place to hide something in a labor camp was in plain sight, mixed with the noise of daily survival. At 01:34 a.m., the door flew open. A guard stormed in, demanding everyone sit up immediately. The prisoners obeyed without hesitation. Jan sat perfectly still, breathing evenly, saying nothing. The guard counted heads, always the first step, and left. Jan knew the routine well. A full inspection would come next, probably at 01:40 a.m., followed by a sweep of the yard, the work sheds, and the perimeter. The Germans' response would follow the same internal logic their army used everywhere. Secure the site, identify the cause, isolate the suspects, execute the likely saboteur. But here was the weakness Jan had counted on. The generator hut was supposed to be locked. The relay was supposed to be guarded. The bridge was supposed to blow only after the order was given. To the Germans, the timing of the explosion made no sense. Nothing else in the camp fit the rules of sabotage. That contradiction alone would stall their investigation. Jan's vision sharpened as he replayed the physical mechanics of the strike. The Siemens relay panel had always been the key. Built in 1928, designed for industrial pumping stations, it handled electrical surges poorly at low temperatures. At -12 degrees, the coil inside the relay stiffened by nearly 12%, requiring higher force to maintain its open state. When struck twice in under 2 seconds, the coil's bracket compressed and recoiled in a predictable wave pattern, forcing the contacts to close long enough to deliver a discharge stronger than its intended ignition. Jan had known this because he had worked with similar relay boards in Katowice mines. He had seen a 2-volt arc ignite flammable dust. Tonight he had seen an 18-volt arc ignite 48 blasting caps. The math was the same. Only the stakes changed. At 01:39 a.m., the Germans ordered every prisoner outside. Jan stood in the lined shoulders, stiff hands exposed to the cold eyes, unfocused. He let his breathing fall into the same broken rhythm as the men around him, exhausted, frightened, cold. A sergeant marched down the line with a flashlight, scanning boots for snow. Jan's boots were wet enough to look normal. No more, no less. The sergeant moved on. At 01:41 a.m., 3 engineers arrived at the ruins of the bridge. They carried lanterns, rifles, clipboards. They shouted at each other over the wind, their confusion rising with every step. One examined the remains of Pier 3 and shouted a conclusion Jan had predicted hours earlier: electrical malfunction. There was no sign of tampering on the riverbank. No cuts in the wires. No footprints near the crates. The detonation had occurred exactly at the relay, and because the hut door had closed cleanly, snow around the entrance remained undisturbed. Jan's strike had left no fingerprint, no shadow, no evidence. At 01:49 a.m., the Germans marched the prisoners back into the barracks. The guards were shaken. The engineer's report made no sense to them. The camp commandant ordered another inspection, then another and another, but each inspection worked in Jan's favor. The more they searched, the more they confirmed nothing was out of place. They did not consider that a single tin cup could hit a relay with enough precision to mimic a timed demolition. They did not consider that a prisoner could calculate guard rotations with the accuracy of a trained officer. They did not consider that the one man capable of understanding their electrical system lived in the same barracks they had just searched. At 02:03 a.m., Jan finally allowed himself to breathe fully. But even then he knew the danger was not over. The Germans would continue searching until dawn. If they found the cup, if they noticed anything unusual, if a single detail misaligned with their report, he would die. Yet the logic of the chain reaction protected him. Technically, according to their own procedures, what had happened should have been impossible. And when something impossible happens under a strictly controlled system, the blame always falls on the system, never the individual. At 02:14 a.m., he lay back on his bunk. His hands throbbed from the cold. The ringing in his ears had not faded. Smoke still clung to his coat. The weight of the act settled in slowly, not as triumph, but as an irreversible shift in the war around him. The bridge was gone. The German timetable was destroyed. Their retreat corridor collapsed, and by dawn 2,500 infantrymen would be stranded on the East Bank with no clear orders. If you believe John's preparation was as critical as the strike itself, comment the number 7. If you believe the explosion was inevitable, regardless of his actions, hit like and subscribe if you want the next section delivered to you. At 02:17 a.m., just 3 minutes after Jan lay back on his bunk, the Schwarzwasser Valley was already drowning in consequences that no one on the German side had planned for. The bridge collapse had sent a pressure wave up the river channel strong enough to register in 2 separate observation posts. The shock rippled through the frozen surface, cracking ice sheets up to 60 meters from the blast site. By 02:20 a.m., engineers confirmed the entire 43-meter central span was gone, along with the structural integrity of Piers 3, 4, and 5. The TNT charge, originally wired for a controlled sequence with a precise 5-second cadence, had detonated in a chaotic cascade of less than 1 second. Instead of the Germans shaping the collapse shaped them. By 02:33 a.m., word reached the forward command unit of the 371st Infantry Division. The commander, Oberstleutnant Rademacher, demanded a timeline. The report he received made no sense. According to his engineers, the explosives had been triggered at the relay inside the generator hut, not at the blasting caps on the bridge. That meant the detonation originated from a premature electrical surge, something nearly impossible, given the hut's construction and the Siemens relay's rated tolerance. The engineers stated it plainly: either an electrical malfunction occurred at precisely the wrong moment, or someone had accessed the hut without leaving any trace. Both explanations were unacceptable. Both explanations were true. At 02:49 a.m., the division issued its first emergency order halt: all east-to-west movement, reassess crossings, prepare for encirclement. But preparing for encirclement requires mobility, and mobility requires bridges. Without the Schwarzwasser crossing, the nearest usable structure lay 31 kilometers north, a stone arch over a narrow channel in Gogolin. Redirecting 2,500 men, 48 transport vehicles, 6 anti-tank guns, and 3 radio trucks in winter darkness was not movement, it was disaster in slow motion. The German column stalled before it even began. By 03:12 a.m., the stalled units stretched over 1.4 kilometers of frozen road. Engines idled, fuel burned, temperatures dropped. A quarter of the men were already dealing with frostbite. A convoy built for steady retreat now became a stationary target. At 03:40 a.m., a reconnaissance officer reported another problem. The East Bank civilian zones were packed with refugees, 5,312 people, based on 2 days of counts who had taken shelter near the river and were now trapped by the river's newly unstable ice. The original German retreat plan had called for a controlled burn of 3 villages in the evacuation path. That burn depended on a clean withdrawal across the bridge. But without the bridge, the burn orders were useless. The trapped infantry could not advance. They could not retreat. They could not torch anything. They could only wait in the dark as Soviet artillery began probing the western ridges. At 04:05 a.m., while the German high command scrambled for answers, Soviet scouts from the 1st Ukrainian Front, moving at 18 kilometers per day since crossing the Pilika, picked up the sound of the explosion echoing through the valley. They noted the timing, the direction, the estimated distance, and relayed the report to their artillery battalion. Bridge demolition at night meant one thing: Germans in disarray. A retreat corridor lost, a defense line compromised. Soviet forward observers adjusted their approach routes accordingly, tightening their pincer toward Strzelce-Opolski without delay. At 04:22 a.m., German engineers finally reached a firm conclusion. The bridge had not been blown by Allied airstrike sabotage on the piers or external charges. It had been triggered internally at the relay from inside the generator hut. But not a single footprint tool, mark, scratch, or bent wire suggested someone had forced a detonation. The engineers had no explanation because they did not understand what John understood, that the old Siemens relay, stiffened by sub-zero temperatures, could be forced into contact by the right strike with the right force at the right second. They had never seen such a tactic. It had never been recorded. No manual had ever accounted for it. The flaw existed only in theory until Jan made it real. By 04:30 a.m., the bridge collapse had already shifted the entire regional timetable. The 371st Division, expected to withdraw to the Oder by January 20th, now faced a 48-hour delay. That delay exposed their right flank to the advancing 5th Guards Tank Corps. It had taken Jan less than 2 seconds to hit the relay. Those 2 seconds would cost the Germans 2 days. At 05:03 a.m., the situation reached its most dangerous point. A dozen German trucks tried to reposition on the frozen Riverside Road, but the collapse had fractured the ground. 3 vehicles slipped into a sinkhole created by the blast's underground shockwave. One overturned, tearing open its fuel tank. Flames followed. Fuel ignited. Snow turned black. The trapped infantry panicked and scattered into the tree line. Any semblance of order evaporated. At 05:24 a.m., Soviet artillery zeroed in on the valley, firing probing rounds from more than 12 kilometers away. The Germans, caught between fire from the east and a collapsed bridge to the west, could not reposition their guns effectively. They were pinned in the worst possible terrain, an exposed river basin with no maneuver room. By 06:10 a.m., the Soviet artillery had walked its fire directly onto the stalled German column. Trucks exploded. Ammunition crates detonated. Infantry scrambled for cover. In just the first hour of bombardment, the division suffered 267 casualties. Not from battle in trenches, not from a pitched fight, from being immobilized at the wrong place at the wrong moment because a bridge they had counted on no longer existed. By 07:00 a.m., German commanders sent their final urgent request to Corps headquarters: immediate reinforcement or immediate retreat. Both options were impossible. They had no bridge. They had no path. They had no time. And while the valley screamed with artillery and collapsing ice, the small civilian clusters on the east bank, 5,000 people who should have been erased under retreat orders, walked away from the kill zone untouched. The Germans could not burn their villages. They could not advance to clear them. They could not detonate anything else without burning their own trapped men. John's early explosion had fractured their entire doctrine. One man, one cup, one relay. Thousands of lives shifted off the line between destruction and survival. If you agree that the bridge's early collapse reshaped the entire regional battle, comment the number 7. If you think the Germans could have recovered even without the bridge hit, like so we see your take. And subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this unfolding war. At 07:14 a.m., nearly 6 hours after the bridge vanished into the Schwarzwasser, the camp commander initiated the first of 3 full interrogations. The guards dragged every prisoner into the yard and formed them into 4 lines, 78 men per row, breath-freezing in tight clouds above their heads. The Germans were shaken. Not angry shaken. A bridge wired with 102 kilograms of industrial TNT guarded by armed engineers operating on a strict retreat schedule had detonated 5 days early without the smallest trace of human interference. That kind of anomaly broke the logic the German war machine depended on. They needed the blast to make sense. They demanded the event be explainable. And when a system built on procedure faces the inexplicable, it hunts for culprits even when none exist. At 07:22 a.m., the interrogation began. The guards searched for frost on clothing, soot on hands, metal dust on sleeves, anything that could have come from an electrical panel. They checked boots for debris from the generator hut's concrete floor. They looked for signs of recent exertion, accelerated heart rate, labored breathing, trembling hands. Jan prepared for that scrutiny. He had spent the first minutes of the chaos rubbing snow on his coat to hide the thin layer of soot from the panel blast. He had pressed his hands into the frozen ground to equalize the temperature with those of the other prisoners. When the guards lifted his arms and checked his sleeves, all they found was cold fabric and dried sweat from a day of forced labor. At 07:33 a.m., an engineer arrived to question the men directly. He demanded anyone who had seen unusual activity to step forward. No one moved. He repeated the order. Again, silence. The prisoners were terrified, but not stupid. Sabotage in a labor camp meant collective punishment. Speaking was death even for the innocent. The engineer scanned their faces, trying to spot guilt. But guilt was impossible to identify in men who had lived 4 years under conditions that erased all excess emotion. Fear looked like fatigue. Exhaustion looked like obedience. And Jan looked exactly like the kind of prisoner no one noticed thin, quiet, predictable. At 07:48 a.m., the Germans turned their attention to the generator hut. They searched every centimeter of the floor, the panel, the wiring, the latch, the hinges. Nothing was damaged except the relay. The metal brackets showed signs of compression, consistent with electrical surge, not with manual tampering. The wiring remained intact. The cable routing matched the engineer logs. Snow around the threshold held no footprints. The interior dust patterns were undisturbed. It was the perfect crime because it was not designed as a crime. It was an exploitation of the one weakness the Germans refused to imagine, that a prisoner could outthink their system without leaving clues. At 08:10 a.m., the Germans expanded the investigation. They inspected the barracks, overturned mattresses, dumped personal items onto the ground, and seized anything made of metal. They searched for tools, keys, scraps of wire nails, makeshift chisels. They found nothing more suspicious than a few broken spoons and a handful of rusted belt buckles. Jan's tin cup lay exactly where he had dropped it, wedged between two boards indistinguishable from 24 other battered cups in the barracks. The Germans handled it twice without noticing the dented edge that had struck the relay. To them, it was just another piece of camp trash. At 08:42 a.m., the camp commander issued a new order: isolate all men with technical training. That meant miners, machinists, electricians, mechanics. 28 prisoners, Jan among them, were pulled into a separate line. The commander questioned them one by one, asking about their pre-war jobs, their skills, their familiarity with explosives. Jan answered each question in monotone, describing himself as a low-level mine electrician who handled ventilation, wiring, not detonation circuits. He used the same explanation he had rehearsed for years. He made himself smaller in tone, smaller in presence, smaller than the truth. The commander's notes reflected exactly what Jan intended: E93 145 minimal technical competency. Low risk. At 09:05 a.m., the investigation escalated into physical searches. Jackets off, shirts off, feet checked for burns, palms checked for electrical marks. The Germans expected that anyone who had triggered an arc strong enough to fire blasting caps would show signs of microburns or static scars. But Jan had struck the relay with the cup not his hand. The arc had traveled through the metal housing. His skin never touched the current. His hands showed nothing but cracked knuckles and swollen joints identical to every other prisoner. At 09:27 a.m., the engineers submitted their preliminary conclusion to the commander. The report stated that the detonation resulted from a structural failure in the relay bracket caused by low-temperature aging components and voltage drift. It was, in their words, an internal mechanical accident. The commander hated this explanation. He called it insufficient. But without evidence to the contrary, he had no choice. The German military accepted mechanical failures as long as they could be documented. They did not accept sabotage without proof. And here, proof did not exist. At 10:12 a.m., the commander addressed the prisoners again. He warned them that any future tampering would result in summary execution. His voice cracked with anger. His eyes revealed fear. He needed to assert control in a camp that had just proven itself vulnerable. But he also needed to maintain labor output. Killing prisoners would slow bridge repairs, road clearing, and supply hauling. He threatened execution because it was the only weapon he still possessed. But he did not pull the trigger. Jan understood that instantly. It meant the danger was ending. At 10:45 a.m., the Germans ended the formal search. By 11:00 a.m., the prisoners were ordered back to work. The camp returned to its mechanical rhythm, though the guards kept glancing at the bridge ruins as if the ground itself had betrayed them. John shoveled snow beside Pier 1, forcing his breathing to stay steady, forcing his thoughts to stay quiet. He did not allow himself to feel victory. Victory in a place like E93 invited danger. What he felt instead was a tightening certainty the Germans had accepted the impossible as an accident. They had closed the case. They had stopped looking for a saboteur because the event did not fit sabotage logic. They believed their own narrative because they needed it to be true. At 12:16 p.m., during a short break, Jan glanced at the smoke hanging low over the river. The bridge was gone. The retreat corridor was gone. The burn orders were gone. The civilians across the valley were still alive. The trapped German infantry was still immobilized. The Soviets would reach the ridgeline faster than the Germans could reorganize. For the first time in 4 years, Jan allowed himself to consider the possibility that he might live long enough to witness liberation. If you believe John's survival depended as much on German blindness as on his own precision, comment the number 7. If you think the investigation could have exposed him with just one mistake, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the final chapter of the story. At 06:58 p.m. that evening, long after the sun had vanished behind the ridgelines and frost had begun to crust over the twisted wreckage of the Schwarzwasser Bridge, the camp settled into an uneasy quiet that felt like the first silence in a century. Smoke still drifted over the river. The cracked ice still groaned from the shockwave. The Germans still paced the yard with rifles slung too tight across their backs. But the chaos of the morning was gone. The interrogation was over. The engineers had filed their malfunction report. The chain of command had accepted the fiction. And Jan, who had set the entire sequence of events in motion with 2 strikes of a tin cup, lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of what he had done finally settle into the space between breaths. At 07:11 p.m., he replayed the moment of detonation, not as triumph but as consequence. He thought of the arc that leapt across the relay. At 01:27:19 a.m., a thread of white-blue light, no wider than a pencil line, the kind of spark most electricians forget after a decade in the trade. Yet that tiny flicker had torn open the valley, halted a division, and saved thousands. The numbers circled in his mind because numbers had always guided him. 102 kilograms of TNT transferred into 8 tons of downward force on Pier 3. 108 meters per second of shockwave velocity through the river ice. 2,500 German infantry stranded. 5,300 civilians spared. 2 seconds of impact. 1 man behind the strike. That arithmetic, brutal and unforgiving, was the closest thing he had to peace. At 07:26 p.m., the barracks dimmed, and the men around him whispered their theories about the explosion. Some believed the engineers had mishandled the wiring. Others thought Frost had cracked the caps. A few imagined Allied planes overhead in the dark. No one mentioned sabotage. No one dared. But when Jan listened closely, he heard something else woven into their voices' relief. The kind that comes from a tragedy, prevented rather than a victory achieved. The kind that burns quietly in the chest rather than exploding like the bridge. They didn't know why the bridge was gone, only that the Germans were suddenly less certain, less organized, less in control. In a camp like E93, that meant everything. At 07:40 p.m., a guard passed by the window boots, crunching on the brittle snow. Jan watched the silhouette cross the yard and disappear into the orange haze of a lantern. The guard had no idea that the man he had walked past earlier that morning, the thin prisoner with the cracked knuckles and hollow cheeks, had altered the division's fate. He had no idea that the retreat timeline he carried in his pocket could no longer function. He had no idea that the Soviets, now advancing unopposed toward the valley, would reach the ridgeline 36 hours ahead of projection. All because a single prisoner refused to obey the most absolute rule in the camp. At 08:03 p.m., Jan finally closed his eyes. Not to sleep, to remember. He saw the mines of Katowice, the relay rooms, the sparks, the faces of men he had worked with before the war. He remembered the way a small error underground could kill dozens. He remembered why precision mattered. And now, for the first time, he realized that the war had given him one chance, only one, to use that precision, not to prevent death, but to prevent the scale of death that comes with retreat orders and scorched earth commands. He had always said that someone somewhere would have to make the impossible choice. Tonight, for reasons he could not explain even to himself, that someone had been him. At 08:21 p.m., he thought about what would happen next. The Germans would regroup, yes. They would attempt to reform their lines, but they would never regain the hours lost. And war is a machine of hours. Hours decide who escapes encirclement. Hours decide who reaches bridges before they fall. Hours decide who lives long enough to see another sunrise. His 2 seconds of contact inside the generator hut had stolen 48 hours from the retreating division. Those 48 hours would ripple through the front like fractures through ice. The Soviets would advance. The trapped German infantry would be unable to burn the villages. The civilians would survive. The war in this valley would tilt. At 08:44 p.m., as a single lantern flickered out somewhere near the mess hall, Jan felt something that surprised him. He felt small. Not insignificant, but small in the way a fuse is small, a wire is small, a relay switch is small, things that by themselves mean little. But in the right moment, under the right pressure, in the right hands, they determine outcomes far larger than anyone anticipates. He realized his act did not make him a hero. It made him a component, a necessary one. The war was a circuit, and tonight he had closed a connection no one else could. At 09:02 p.m., he opened his eyes again. The barracks were quiet. The guards were calmer. The snow had stopped falling, and somewhere across the valley, families who expected to die in flames were still alive, unaware that a prisoner with a dented tin cup had shifted their fate. He wondered if they would ever know the truth. He wondered if anyone would. And then he understood the answer. They wouldn't. The record would never list his name. The Germans would file the collapse as a malfunction. The Soviets would assume it was part of retreat chaos. History would fold the moment into a footnote. And that was exactly how this story would survive. If you believe the anonymity makes Jan's act, greater comment the number 7. If you believe a hero deserves recognition, hit, like So We See Your Stance. And if these stories matter to you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.